Welcome to my loose watercolor tutorial, Misty Falls. This is the narrated step-by-step version of this video at normal speed. It's designed to be the companion video to my Misty Falls loose watercolor demonstration video, which is set to music at 3x speed without any narration. The value study on the right is the reference for this painting. It's a very simple sketch, and this painting isn't intended to be a very complex painting. It's more intended to be a fun exercise where you can experiment with free-flowing washes and a limited palette. The painting is done on an 8x10 piece of 140-pound cold-pressed Lanaquarel watercolor paper taped to a piece of gator board with masking tape, so it's not a large painting. As I mentioned, this is done with a limited palette. For the most part, it's done with two colors, sap green and royal blue. From time to time, I worked a touch of Pyrrole red, which is in the top left corner of my palette, to drive a little bit more towards neutral, but for the most part, it's done with these two colors. As I work with these two colors, you can start to see the different combinations I can get with a blue versus a pure sap green, and then when you mix them together, you start to get a blue-green. When I put a heavier concentration of pigment in there, it gets a darker value. And royal blue is a very dark valued paint, and I use it often in my mixtures to help give me dark values. But the combination of sap green and royal blue gives me what I feel is a nice blue-green tone that I can do a lot with. The mixtures on your palette are all about ratios, and you can swing back and forth for more blue to a more green just by the amount of each paint that you're putting in there. So let's take a quick look and see what that looks like on paper. Remember, mixing color doesn't happen just on your palette, it also happens on your painting surface, and it gives a very desirable effect. So what I've done here is I've put a brush stroke of pure sap green on the left and pure royal blue on the right, and now I'm going to let those two colors mingle on the paper, and you can start to see the very nice gradation of color that you get, and the more water you add, the lighter it's going to get. But if you experiment and charge your shapes that you're putting on your paper with this variety of color and let it mix on the paper, it gives a very desirable result. One of the things I'll point out is I often get asked if I work on an incline or a flat surface. People say, well, we like to work on a flat surface. It's very tough to get this kind of gradation and control of a liquid wash when you're working flat. It's very difficult to do. So this is why I always work on a incline of about 15 to 20 degrees. So I've let these colors mingle in that center of the paper here in that gradated wash, and then on the sides here I'm just putting in a variety of tones that I can get with this mixture. And again, this variation comes by changing the proportions of the two colors on your palette. I think sometimes people get a mixture on their palette and it turns to what they think is mud, and then they just give up on it. But if you don't like the result of what you have on your palette, just change the proportion, add more of one color, and it'll start to swing back to a less neutral color. And now I'm ready to begin the painting. So you saw that I was using a very simple value sketch for reference, and now I'm just going to put down a very simple pencil sketch here to get me started. And I'm using a B pencil, and I'm just drawing a very, very basic drawing here lightly with this B pencil. I'm not trying to draw the trees per se, I'm just giving an indication of where the trunks are going to be and where the waterfall is and some of the other major shapes, and that's really all I need to get this painting going. And keep in mind, this is just kind of a fun exercise, and not getting pinned down into trying to copy a photograph or anything. That's not the approach here. So don't burden yourself with a heavy heavily detailed sketch if you're going to do this. Just give yourself the indication and then have some fun with your paints and your brushes. I'm going to begin with a cool mixture of the sap green and royal blue. It's leaning a little bit more towards the royal blue side of things. Sometimes that's hard to see in the video, but the distant tree line here I'm trying to give the suggestion of with this bluish green tone. And then I'm going to take the fine mist spray bottle that I use and soften that up a little bit and let it start to flow down the page. And it's going to create that kind of foggy, misty effect and make it feel like these shapes are in the distance. Now, as I paint this, my primary two colors are sap green and royal blue. However, occasionally I'll work just a little bit of pyrrole red into my mixture to take some of the rawness off the green, especially when I'm putting down a tone that leans more towards the green side than the blue side. I do that a little bit more so the green doesn't look as raw. And here you can see that I've worked a warmer mixture of the sap green and royal blue into this wash. And that helps give the perception of some of that might be closer than the others in terms of warm and cool. And now as I start to move more towards the foreground with my tree shapes, I'm warming up the mixture that I'm using, and it's leaning more towards a mixture of sap green and royal blue, or shall I say it's got a heavier concentration of the green in the mixture than the royal blue. And so now I'm starting to get the warm and the cool playing off each other as one in the distance and one in the foreground. So I'm continuing to put in some of these tree shapes with a fairly dark valued tone that favors the sap green, and I'm using the lines that I put with my pencil sketch to indicate where I was going to have the trees, just to indicate the trunk is a reference point. However, I'll arbitrarily put in various shapes where I just feel that it fits the design, it fits the composition. And then I come back in here and I hit it with a spray bottle and just let the paint flow down a little bit. I'm just trying to create this free-flowing feeling in this painting. And in the foreground there, in front of those trees and coming down the side of what would be like a rocky edge, I'm just letting the color and the value just kind of flow down there. I'm not really rendering it. And right here I have very soft edges. So as I apply this tone with the brush, initially it's got a little bit of a hard edge, and I hit it with this spray bottle and it softens it up. And I have to balance that back and forth a little bit on how much I spray it and how much I don't, or leave it alone to maintain some of that hard edge. Every now and then I spray a little bit more than I want, and I get an edge that's not as defined as I would like or intended, and I just dry it, and then I come back in with a darker value and go for the effect that I'm after. And I'm going to repeat the process here. I'm coming back in with a dark value and giving a suggestion of another tree here. And I'm using this quill brush that I like to use. It comes a very sharp, very nice point, and gives a very sharp shape when you want it. It's good for detail work. But I'm trying to give a suggestion of a tree here in the foreground. And you can see I'm trying to create this feeling that some of these trees with very soft edges are more distant than the ones that are more in the foreground with a harder edge. Those tend to come forward more, and they're overlapping, and they also have a warmer tone than some of those in the background. I'm going to soften it still a little bit with a spray bottle, but not too much. I still want to maintain some of that sharper edge just to suggest that it's closer to you and in the foreground. Something else that I want to point out is, as I make these tree shapes, one of the things I try to be aware of is you don't want every tree to look the same. And by that I mean you don't want to have every tree the same size, the same length, the same width. You don't want them to all have the same level of detail. Let some be a little less defined than others, and have some start lower than others, and vary the spacing between the trees. Maybe have one right on top of one and one beside one, but you need to keep that variety in your composition when you're putting these trees in. You don't want it to look like you took a stamp and just stuck on little stylized pine trees. Here I'm trying to draw some more of that green tone down into the lower area of my composition using the spray, and I'm going to come back in with a loaded brush, a very soft wash brush, and help that along, bringing some darker values into that area. And I like the way that it's just kind of understated, and there's a lot of lost and found edges. There's a lot of suggestion of edges. It's like the waterfall. There's not an edge on the right side of that going all the way down, but you know that exists. You know that there's a boundary where the water stops and the land starts, but it's a lost edge. And the ability to put those in your paintings and work in your compositions, I think, just adds a lot of interest when you can work lost and found edges into your painting, whether it's a landscape or a floral or still life. It makes for an interesting composition. It doesn't give the suggestion that everything is outlined. The further I get in my painting process, the more deliberate I get with my brush strokes. I've got my quill brush that, again, has a very fine point I like to use for detail work, and I've got a dark value that's a mixture that has a lot of pigment in it. It's not real fluid, and just applying this value wet on dry, and just really trying to highlight some of the shapes and bring attention to where I want to draw the eye, using darker values and sharper edges. And I'm still just a little touch of a spray to soften a little bit of an edge, but not much. And I'm using that water there to draw a little dark value down again into that rock face. But here I'm working the other side of this waterfall, and it kind of helps pull the eye between the two dark valued trees there, and move the eye around my composition. So again, it's darker value, sharper edges, just trying to describe a little bit more the details of the tree. But still, it's very stylized, and it's not what you would call rendered. As I work on this pine tree here, I decided that I want to put another dark shape there to the left of that, and so I'm just going to put in another suggestion of a pine tree right beside that one, and I'll just let it kind of run right into the other shape, soften it up a little bit with a spray bottle, and then just move on. Here I'm decided I'm going to stick another little smaller tree back there. Same process. And I'm taking some of this darker value, this tone, to give the indication of ground. You know, one of the things that you want to have in a landscape is some indication of a horizontal plane. That's just what how landscapes are. There's a line of sight and a horizon line that we're used to seeing. And if you're painting a landscape and you don't see that, it just doesn't seem in balance. And I've dried my paper here, and I'm coming in with a kneaded eraser. I didn't have a lot of pencil marks, but I'm just taking this eraser and getting rid of those light pencil marks. Sometimes when I'm doing a landscape, I'm going to have trees. I might do some masking with a fine line masking pen before I start to save some of that. But I didn't do that in this case, and I'm just going to come in with a flat brush that's been dampened with water, and I'm just going to lift the indication of a tree trunk in some of these tree shapes using this wet flat brush, and just I hit it with a brush and touch it with a Kleenex to help lift off some of the color. It doesn't give a real bright white, it just gives a subtle indication of a linear shape there that represents a tree trunk. And here again, just like I was talking about varying the trees, I want to try and vary the length of these marks that I'm making here, these linear shapes. I don't want them to all to be the exact same length. And I try and start some at the top and pick them back up at the bottom and let the line be broken where I can. But there's really only so much you can do when you're lifting off on this type of a surface. There's some such hot press or Yupo which are much more forgiving in that way. But this allows for some lifting, but not a lot. To help make the suggestion of those tree trunks a little bit stronger and more pronounced, I'm coming in with a dark value using this fine point quill brush, laying these darker linear shapes in parallel with the area that I lifted off. Just makes it more pronounced. And again, you can see that I tried to vary the length of the brush strokes as I put those down. I'm also taking this darker value and trying to reinforce that horizontal plane going across there to make that suggestion a little bit stronger. And I'm taking this brush with a dark value on it and just making some brush marks around the composition. It helps provide some depth, and it can help provide direction as you apply this. And they're not big involved brush strokes. They're just very simple marks. You can see how little it takes to give the suggestion of a stronger edge or of movement in the composition. These are very small brush strokes I'm making here, but they start to lead you down or across the rocky surface that would be there on this waterfall. And here again, very, very small, dark marks, and it just helps reinforce that edge, and then it gets lost as it moves further down the page. And here on the left side, I've carried that down a little farther. And I'm making some of those same marks here on the rocky face. Again, these are not big involved shapes that I'm making. They're just little marks that give the indication of movement and help lead the eye around the composition. I've decided I want a little bit more intensity in that blue tone that I have on that waterfall. So I've taken my royal blue and put a little darker value, a little bit more intense mixture, and put that on that waterfall. And then again, I'm softening it with my fine mist spray and letting that trickle down just as a waterfall would do. I'm also going to take some of that blue tone because I'd like to have a little bit more of it across my composition, and I'm making some marks that are similar to the darker value marks I made, and it's hard to pick out in the video, but that's actually the same blue tone that I have on the waterfall that I'm just touching in a few places around the composition just to help move that color around and not make it feel so isolated. I have a little bit of that in the distant trees, in the kind of misty trees in the background, but I want to draw a little bit of that color into the rest of the composition. So I'm just using these small brush marks that I've made as a way of doing that. I'm repeating the process here, taking a darker value and trying to further define a few of the trees that I want to stand out. And I've done this several times through the painting, and there's no set number on how often you have to do this kind of give and take, and where you start with a soft and you start to define these trees, and then I spray them and they get a little less defined, but I come back with a darker value, and I'm very specific with my brush strokes, very deliberate on where I'm putting those, and it's wet on dry, so it really starts to give definition to the trees. But I do it until I feel comfortable with it, and it's this process of continuing to build layers, working from light to dark, that I use frequently when I'm doing a painting. Now, one of the final details I want to put in here is I'm taking this small rigger brush, and I'm giving the indication of a few of these kind of old nag trees, they call them. It helps give some interest and give a little bit of depth to the painting. You can see the one hanging out over the waterfall starts to really make those distant trees feel more distant when you have that dark shape in the foreground. And I'm working these in between the trees and a few places on the trees, but it just gives another level of detail and interest for the composition. And I don't have this in my value sketch. These are just shapes that I want to add in the areas that I feel could use it and to bring a little interest to it. And again, it's all kind of based on where I want to draw the eye to. And I vary the tone a little bit. This is more of a light green tone that I'm putting in there. And if I wanted, I could come in here with some burnt sienna and put some kind of wood tones in here, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to leave it with this very limited palette. So here's the very simple value sketch that I began with. And here's the painting that I ended up with, using that as a reference. Well, this is a very simple exercise. There's a lot of information in it, and there's a lot of key points that I tried to make along the way. So I'm going to take a moment here at the end and do a quick review. Before I started the painting, I mentioned that I'd be working with a limited palette of sap green and royal blue, and working in a little touch of pyrrole red here and there to take the rawness off the green. But for the most part, 2 colors, but you can get a variety of tones out of those 2 colors. I also talked about how you have the option to let paint mix on the paper. You don't have to do all your mixing in your palette, and it makes for a very interesting result. And the one thing also I pointed out was you really need to be effective at this and get the nice gradation. It really has to be an incline, and you need the help of gravity to get the very nice gradation that you're after. I mentioned using 2 sets of opposites to help indicate distance, warm against cool and hard edge against soft edge. That's what I've done here, where I have the distant tree line, which is a cooler blue-green with soft edges, contrasting the trees in the foreground, which have a warmer green tone and have a harder edge to them. I talked about varying the size of shapes, and when I have these trees which are repetitive in nature, then I don't want to make them look all the same. I don't want to look like I took a stamp and just put down a bunch of pine trees, so I vary the length and the width and the spacing on those to help make the composition more interesting. I talked about when working with a landscape, the need to somewhere give some indication of a horizontal plane that more accurately represents what you see in nature. And when you don't have some indication of a horizontal plane, it just feels out of balance. So it doesn't take much. You just somewhere in your composition, you need to give some indication that there's a horizontal plane, and it'll make a difference in a landscape composition. I also talked about lost and found edges, such as in this waterfall. There's just a suggestion that this continues down the page. There's not an outline around the whole waterfall. There's an edge that's created by the green and the blue tone or the white tone coming down partway down the waterfall, but it doesn't follow it all the way down the page, but the eye follows it, and you know that edge continues. Even though this is a simple exercise, there's still a lot of common practices that are applied here that you use in a more complex piece of work. The elements and principles of design, the technical aspects of the medium, they're all being applied here. I think with the simplicity of the composition and the piece, and it's a smaller piece, it's easier to talk about some of those elements and to see them because it's not such an involved painting that you're looking at. Whether you choose to do a painting like this for fun or to hone your skills, I think it serves as a good reminder on what watercolor is all about, the spontaneity that's there and the fluidity of the medium. I think it's something that you just can't get with any other medium. Thank you for watching my video. If you have specific questions about the materials I use in my process, you can find them on the studio page of my website, rsurowiczart.com. You can also sign up for my newsletter. If you have specific questions, you can email me at contact@rsurowiczart@gmail.com. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like it and share it, and I welcome your comments. You can follow me on Facebook, and I've been asked about the possibility of starting a Facebook community for those who subscribe to my YouTube channel. So I'm conducting a poll at the end of this video to determine if there's enough interest. Thank you in advance if you decide to participate.